This episode is brought to you by Brilliant, the online learning platform that allows you to learn about interesting and important topics through a fun and interactive method of teaching that enables anyone to master almost any topic from basics to advanced. In short, easy to follow lessons. Brilliant's first principles approach helps you build understanding from the ground up, which is usually where I need to begin on a lot of these topics. For example, here's one on foundational math. I like to pick ones that I don't know much about. I have next to no training in formal math. This is with algebra. The last time I had algebra was middle school. All right. So here's just the different programs they have. Foundational math, solving equations, understanding graphs, measurement, vectors. And here's one, functions and quadratics. I'm already lost. But you know what? I can master this in no time because of the way that they do it. This is way better than just watching online lectures and videos on science and math, because here through Brilliant, you actually do tasks one by one, and each step they give you a little quiz and you see how you're doing. So check it out. Go to brilliant.org/skeptic to get a free trial that lasts 30 days and 20% off your annual premium subscription. Brilliant.org/skeptic. Check it out. All right. Thanks for watching. I should point out to listeners that there is a huge scholarship and community of people that study religious beliefs, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, and so on. There's a sociology of religion, anthropology of religion, psychology of religion. There's textbooks, conferences, journals, and so on. And like, say, Richard's book, The God Delusion, it's not really trying to engage with that community. It's a popular book. This is his opinions. These are his arguments. Here's the arguments he heard. Here's why he thinks they're wrong. This is what you're doing is different in a way.
Yeah.
You're addressing that community of people, and it is a interesting, lively debate. Why do people believe in God? Why do people join religions? What do they get out of it? What's the purpose of it, culturally, socially, personally, and so on? And that's really, in many ways, a different question from the, I guess, ontological question. Is there really a God? Is there really one true religion? You're not really trying to answer those questions, but that's what Dawkins is trying to do, and Sam Harris and Hitch and Dan Dennett, who we just lost. Their point was not just why do people believe, but they shouldn't believe, and here's why.
Yeah, and I think that the question that I'm getting at is also not just why do people believe, but what is it that they're doing when they engage in this kind of cognitive relation of religious credence? Okay, if I were to say, well, why does Michael believe that he has a microphone in front of him? We could refer to your perceptual states and so on, and it would be a largely evidence-based updating kind of thing, right? But before you say, well, why is it that religious people believe that there are these invisible supernatural beings? You have to come face to face with the possibility, at least on my view, that they're engaging in a different kind of relation to that idea from how I relate to the idea that my next door neighbor exists, right? It's a different sort of thing from factual belief. So religious credence, this is my terminology, is different from factual belief.
Right. Okay. So the way I phrase it, I guess empirical truths that you can just look out the window and see if it's there or not, versus religious truths or mythological truths or whatever terms you want to use, which have a different kind of cognitive epistemology. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Kind of, but let me emphasize an important distinction here, right? And that's between attitude type and content, right? So content is just what your belief is about, okay? Attitude type is how you're relating to that content. So here's an interesting contrast. So let's have our listeners think along. So say you have someone who has a little shrine to Elvis set up in her garage. We'll call her Sheila, and she has like candles around it, right? So she believes, in some sense of the word believes, that Elvis is alive, right? So the belief has the content that Elvis is alive. Well, say someone it's 1978 or whatever, and someone else is in the Antarctic, and they didn't have access to news, didn't catch the news that Elvis died, right? And they just think that Elvis is alive, right? So notice how I use the word think there, right? It's a little bit of a gesture at a different kind of relation. So the content in either case is the same. That Elvis is alive, but they're relating to it in a different way. The one with the shrine has this kind of reverential identity constituting way of relating to the ideas, and the person who just happens to have a false factual belief is going to go poof as soon as she confronts the evidence. So setting aside differences in terms of contents and truth values, right? Those can range all over the place. There's different ways of relating to ideas, right? So just as imagining, I can imagine you not having a microphone in front of you. So it's not a difference in content from the sorts of things that we can factual believe. It's rather a different way of relating to the ideas. And I think this is really important because a lot of religious credence contents, they are empirically tractable, right? You can see, you can do scientific research to discover that the earth is billions of years old, okay? So it's not as if the claim itself that the earth is 10,000 years or younger that the young earth creationists make, it's not as if that's not empirically tractable or it doesn't have any sort of truth value or anything like that. I'm with Dawkins on that one. That's something that we can prove false. But the question then becomes, what are people doing when they embrace that content? And it's not just, this is kind of a point. I think I was reading your conspiracy theories book. So I think you kind of are sympathetic to this way of thinking. It's not just that people, dumbly believe this false content, but rather it's the religious credence embrace of that content is a different way of relating to ideas, right? So that's the main kind of, I don't know, like theoretical judo that I do in my book. If I can flatter myself with that kind of talk, it's like shift focus away from content type and truth value and look at, hey, there's a different way of relating to ideas here.
Yeah. Tell me if this would be an example. So, did someone named Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? Well, there's people, the mythicists say probably not, but I think most historians, even atheists like Bart Ehrman, say, yeah, he
Sure.
probably existed. Okay.
Sure.
Was he crucified? Well, the Romans crucified everybody for practically anything, so that's not an extraordinary claim.
Yeah.
So was he really dead for 3 days, and was he resurrected from the dead? And then the last one is, did he die for your sins? These seem to me radically different kinds of questions, epistemologically or cognitively.
Yeah. So I do think that the reasons for engaging in religious credence are of a very different sort, right? It's more voluntary. It's not evidence-based. It's it kind of aims at emotional satisfaction and oneness with the group, right? And so the what it does for you personally and interpersonally is really what the religious credences aim at, right? And this is why oftentimes even when religious credences have contents that are empirically tractable, people don't give them up in the face of evidence, right? Just like if you like to say you're I don't know if you've ever done any acting, but seems like you could pull it off. So say you're playing Hamlet, right? If I were to say to you, hey dude, you're not really Hamlet, right? You've got I've seen photos of you and it says Michael Shermer and all that kind of stuff. You would kind of
be like, what?
You're missing the point, right? Yeah. I'm engaging in one cognitive relation to the idea that I'm Hamlet, and it's imagining. And that's not an evidentially vulnerable kind of relation, whereas factual belief is an evidentially vulnerable relation. All right? So factual beliefs, you can't just decide to believe that today is Saturday. And, knowing that today is Wednesday, you can't just decide to not believe today is Wednesday. So that's one characteristic of factual beliefs. It's sort of like you can't help but being governed by evidence when it comes to factual beliefs. So that's kind of one of the most important differences in terms of the kind of cognitive relation that factual belief is versus religious credence. Or so I argue. I've got my critics, but that's the basic stance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're onto something there. in the same way that I argue conspiracy theorists, they're not uneducated, stupid people, tinfoil hat wearing kids in their parents' basement, adult kids in their parents' basement. They're really thoughtful, intelligent, educated people. Everybody believes some kind of conspiracy theory, and for good reason, because a lot of them are true, turn out to be true. So it pays to believe. Now, a lot of them, people just have no way to know for sure. Was the 2020 election rigged, or were there some improprieties or it's inappropriate action in Georgia or Arizona? How would I know? I pretty much go on what my party says, or the party bosses, or the people that are in charge. And, I think most of us can't fact check most things. I presume that my money's going to be valuable because it's not based on gold, it's fiat money. It's kind of a useful fiction, I guess, in a way, make believe that the money is valuable and that the society will exist. And I don't know, there's just a lot of stuff just walking around that we actually don't fact check. We just assume. I don't know if you call that faith-based or fantasy or useful fictions or whatever.
Yeah, I think this is a comparison to conspiracy theories is kind of interesting. We're on a little bit thin ice here, right? Because we're, on the one hand, we're talking about major religions. On the other hand, we're talking about conspiracy theories. But I think there's sort of a parallelism that's worth going into. So you point out in your recent book, Conspiracy, that there's this thing called proxy conspiracies, right? Or proxy conspiracy theories, where it's kind of like people have a sort of deeper, more solid, tell me if I'm getting your view wrong, right? This is turning the tables on you here, Michael. So a deeper conviction that, say, the government is really doing something oppressive in relation to them. And then the more kind of florid conspiracy theories, right, with all their bells and whistles, which are quite outlandish, those are kind of a way of expressing some sort of deeper commitment, right?
Yep.
And the conspiracy theorists needn't be so crazy as to simply factually believe that I don't know, the 9/11 event was an inside job, right? But this is an idea that kind of helps them articulate some more underlying conviction, right? So we have what I call a two-map cognitive structure there, right? You have what you might say is that which is factually believed, and then you have some more imaginative ways of relating to the more florid and specific ideas of the conspiracy theory, right? That, engaging in that brings you together with some sort of community. All right. And I think this two-map cognitive structure is something that you see in religion all over the place, right? Where you've got your factual beliefs about the world and how it works and which group you belong to and everything like that. And then you have these stories like Jonah got swallowed by a whale and lived in the belly of a whale for 3 days. And that, a virgin gave birth to a deity. Okay, and that this deity could cure blindness by putting mud on people's eyes and so on. And it's, even if a lot of, say, evangelical Christians are going to say, oh, yes, I think that's literally fact, it's more like an identity constituting game of make-believe that relates to factual belief in the same way imaginings do, right? So that's the recurring through line of my book, right?
Since you do
some religious credence. Since
you do some neuroscience, are there tractable neuroscience differences in how brains process those different kinds of statements?
Well, it's not that, as far as I can tell from the neuroscience literature, it's not really solidified yet. I think it's kind of what's happening now is there's cognitive and philosophical theory going on about what belief even is. And I think coming up with neural signatures of, say, the difference between religious credence and factual belief, that's a little bit more downstream. But there are some suggestive results, right? So a paper that came out, I believe, in the journal Cognitive Science in 2015, Fondavilla and colleagues, found that there were some similarities between religious idea processing. I think they used minimally counterintuitive deities I can explain that to your audience in a minute if you'd like.
Yeah.
And metaphor processing. All right. So that's sort of suggestive insofar as you can think of, well, metaphors are kind of this thing you regard in a fictional way that is in some way illuminating for you. And then on the neuroscience front, this is going to be somewhat ironic, but Sam Harris and colleagues had a 2009 paper that seems to argue the contrary of my position. Namely, it seems to argue that belief is just one type, whether it's your factual beliefs or your religious beliefs. But actually, if you dig into the data on that paper, you'll notice some interesting differences, which is namely that one of the ones that I thought was most interesting, and we can go back, it's been a while since I read that paper, so we can go back and fact check me on this. But if I recall it correctly, there was a kind of a bigger delay, a bigger time latency when people were assenting to their religious stories and doctrines than when assenting to factual stories and doctrines, right?
That is accurate. I remember that. Yeah. So what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, at first blush, we'd have to think a whole lot further and get a lot more data. But one thing you could think is it's not a straightforward factual belief for them, right? So if I say to a religious person, say who is sitting in your chair, is there a microphone in front of you? Yes. Right. Okay. Was the world actually created in 6 days? Yes. Right. So that one way of interpreting that pause might be they're moving to a different cognitive register. All right. They're kind of shifting gears essentially. Let me mention one other piece of data. This is not neuroscientific, it's behavioral, but some studies that I've done with colleagues, Tanya Lerman, Kara Weissman, Larissa Heifetz, looked at what are the words that people use for expressing different beliefs, right? So if I'm reporting your belief that you've got a bicycle in the garage, I'd say Michael thinks there's a bicycle in the garage. But if, say, you were Buddhist, if I say Michael thinks that Buddha was a great charismatic, it's kind of irreverent. Or say you're a Christian, Michael thinks that Jesus rose from the dead. It's kind of irreverent. So the word believes tends to be used in systematically different ways from how the word thinks is being used, and in ways that can be tracked independently of what the different beliefs are about, right? So if you set someone up in a religious context or with a religious vignette, then they'll tend to use beliefs. If you make it a more matter-of-fact context, they'll tend to use the word thinks. And what I take this to suggest is that people are intuitively aware of the distinction that I'm drawing at a theoretical level, right? Religious believing is a different way of relating to ideas from simply thinking it's so.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. A couple of things come to mind. That you mentioned Tanya Lerman. I had her on the show. Her book, How God Becomes Real. Super interesting.
Great book.
I think it was her book that she mentioned there is a religion of Jedi Knights. Star Wars fans.
Yeah.
I think that was her book. It might have been somebody else. But in any case, those people, of course, they know that, Star Wars is a made-up story. So what are they doing when they're doing their little Jedi Knight religion versus, say, what Christians or Jews or Muslims or anybody else does?
It's Tanya and I have very similar views on this, right? And the answer is that it's an identity constituting game of make-believe. So the way I gesture at this, I start my book with this parable of kids playing on the playground, and they only play with other kids who have the same dolls as them, and they form an in-group, and they have their special play place, and it's in the shady place under the large wooden play structure, and they don't let other kids in who have the wrong kind of doll, right? And this is kind of drawing on my own experience as a kid who would play with GI Joe toys on the playground. And the suggestion is that religions are in many ways a larger scale, much bigger, perhaps much more serious version of that, where the games of make-believe that you're willing to play and you want to play those are the games of make-believe that define and signal your group identity, right? And if that's true, we have to think of the belief processing the quote-unquote belief processing as analogous to imagining, right? So part of what I do in the book, and this is maybe one of the contributions that's original, is really developing a theory of what it is to imagine an idea as opposed to factually believing an idea, and then incorporating that framework into a more rigorous characterization of what I call religious credence.
Since you bring up Mormonism toward the end of your book and the crazy
Right.
gold plate story. Yeah, okay, it's crazy, but it's fairly recent. We can see why it's historically kind of way out there as opposed to being 2,000 years old or 4,000 years old. Julia Sweeney, the comedian, I don't know if you've seen her Letting Go of God monologue. She was a comedian for Saturday Night Live, one of the writers and then one of the actors on Saturday Night Live for several years. Yeah.
I'm going to write this down.
So then she left the show and then started doing monologues. Her monologue is called Letting Go of God. So it kind of tracks her journey from Catholic believer to atheist, skeptic, agnostic, whatever. She was reading my books and Richard Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris and so on. Anyway, but she opens with a funny story. She's a comedian. So she opens with a funny story of the Mormon boys coming by her house in Hollywood. In their starch white shirts and their bicycles, and they go, "We want to talk to you about God," and so on. She's like, "Okay, this is going to be like a pitch meeting, you call my agent and pitch it, and I'll let you know." She goes, "Oh no, that we got to come in and talk to you." So anyway, so they start to tell her the whole story about the lost tribe of Israel, and then Jesus stops by America on the way to heaven, and all the just the goofiness of this story. The gold plates, put his face in the hat with the magic stone so he could translate the hieroglyphics. And she's like, "Okay, stop. Don't start with this story." Okay, even the Scientologists know to start with a personality test.
Right.
And then she says, if you get to go to heaven if you're a believer, and you'll be made whole again. So like if you're blind, you'll see again. If you're deaf, you'll hear again. So Julia says, "Well, I had my uterus taken out because I had cancer. Do I get my uterus back?" And they're like, "What?" It's really funny. And then she goes, "What if you had a nose job and you liked it? Do I have to get my old nose back?" Anyway, I guess that would be taking an approach of more of an empirical approach to these kind of religious claims that represent something else.
Yeah, the sort of there's a certain detail resistance, and both with make believe imaginings and religious credences, that is again a telltale sign of the difference between religious credence and factual belief, right? So if you tell me about a DNA test you took, right, I'd say, well, okay, well, how do you think this DNA from this continent got in there, right? How do you think DNA from that continent got in there, right? Well, okay, well, where did Jesus's DNA come from, right?
Right.
And in asking that question, you're kind of doing what Dennett calls breaking the spell, right? It's not an incoherent question, but it feels rude. And what I want to zero in on, I'm not using that example to try to argue against the virgin birth. Like, I don't need to argue against the virgin birth. Guess what? Virgins don't have babies, right? I'm not going to bother arguing against that. And people who subscribe to Catholicism or Christianity, they also know that virgins don't have babies, right? So what's going on there? And this sort of detail resistance, I think, the spell that Dennett talks about is a sort of a way of protecting the sacred space and of not embarrassing as I'll put it, the sacred play, right? Not forcing people to admit that it's sacred play. So that's why there's that sort of shield around certain questions.
I have a good example of this. I was giving a public talk once where I just riffed on the story I just riffed with you with Julia Sweeney and the Mormons.
Right.
And there was, in the Q&A, a young woman stood up. She says, "I am Mormon." I also made fun of the Mormon underwear. She goes, "I am wearing the Mormon underwear. It isn't what you think. It's not supernatural. There's nothing magical. I'm just paying respect to my religion. I'm just being respectful."
Yeah.
like you'd wear clothes or a ring or whatever. There's nothing magical about my wedding ring. It's just I just wear it as an honor to my wife. That's it.
It's a symbol.
And I thought, yeah, okay, I should not be disrespectful anymore that way. I can see that.
This is a bit of a little bit of a digression, but there's this podcast called the Religious Studies Project, and two I forget their names, but two women, ex-Mormon religious studies scholars, do an episode on the sacred garments, and it is fascinating. I can look that up and shoot you an email.
Is that what they say?
That.
It's something like paying respect and being, modest and respectful and something like that.
Their perspective was more negative. It's it's very but basically they're not well designed for fully functioning females. I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
maybe it's more than I want to know.
yeah. It's hey TMI. But it's interesting stuff. But yeah, interestingly, just looking around at some online discussions of my books that my book that has cropped up, it seems like there's some Mormons who are kind of receptive, right? And which might surprise you, but kind of like, yeah, this is kind of what we're doing, right? We're engaged in this kind of I don't know if they would quite admit it in these terms, but it's a different sort of thing from empirical, just knowing how things are. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Christian at a dinner party, and she says, yeah, I mean, I'm a doctor, right? You don't get people more empirical than me when it comes to thinking about the diseases that my patients have, right? And you don't get someone who scrutinizes the scientific evidence more than me. But when I, relate to my ideas about Jesus, about the resurrection, it's kind of a different frame of mind, right? So Tanya Lerman calls it the faith frame versus, I think she says, the fact frame. But the one frame versus the other frame. And so it's actually the case that some religious believers, maybe more reflective ones, and who maybe aren't as caught up in the idea of an inerrancy, are more receptive to my idea that it's a different kind of cognitive relation than a lot of academics might predict, right? So what does that tell you? Maybe it tells you that those academics have the wrong model of religious psychology.
I think they do. I think that's right. I used to have that model.
Yeah.
I've been rethinking it over the years and thinking of it in different kinds of truths, mythical truths, religious truths, or even political truths versus empirical truths. Okay, a funny story. I don't. Apologies to my listeners who heard this too many times, but I'm at this conference with Richard Dawkins and Ken Miller. Right. Ken Miller is the great. Have you heard me tell this story?
You told it to Eric Schwitzgabel, who was on your show a little while ago.
That's right. So if
bring
I have
it back, bring it back.
Listeners here, yeah,
it's a mythological truth. Well,
yeah. So Richard's doing his thing about the God delusion and all that, and then Ken gives his spiel about mostly intelligent design creationism, which he debunked. But then he wrote a book about this. In the last chapter, he says, by the way, I'm Catholic. And so Richard's like, all right, Ken, let me get this straight. If we found a piece of the true cross finally, and then on the piece of the true cross was a little bit of flesh, we extracted the DNA, and it was Jesus' DNA, and so Ken could see where this was going. He's like, Richard, I'm not claiming any of this is true. I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. And he's like, well, there's not much more to say after that, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Ken was there putting it in a different box, a faith frame rather than a fact frame, whereas Richard's focused on the fact frame.
Right. And if you're in the fact frame, it makes no sense to say, I think that P, but not P, right? You're like, well, if you're declaring not P, then you don't think that P. I mean, what's going on? What's going on here?
Right.
But if it's a different, there's nothing weird about saying, I imagine that P, but not P, or P is not true, right? There's nothing weird about that. You're engaged in a relation to the idea that P in a way that will guide your behavior in certain kinds of play context. And I think this is but you don't necessarily have the factual belief, right? And maybe you don't. And sometimes the point is that you don't. I mean, one of the things that, if I'm right, that what religious credences are supposed to do is just define your group identity, it actually helps to have ones that are a bit irrational or incoherent, or maybe even false. Now, why would that be? Well, imagine a religion that said grass is green and the sun is hot. It wouldn't be distinctive, right? Okay, Neil and Michael make the grass is green and sun is hot religion. It's like, well, right. Doesn't everyone just say that? I mean, what's different about you guys, right? But if we say something like, well, there's a green god of the mountain who is able to hear your thoughts, right? Okay, that flouts reason. But in flouting reason, it becomes distinctive, right? And so group identity beliefs, in weird ways, they actually do their job better. And this is I think one of my important contributions, if I may say so. It's they do their job better if they have sort of odd or implausible or even outright false contents, because that distinguishes the in-group, right? If you're going to bear the costs of asserting this and embracing this, then, you're different. You're different from other groups, right? And I can trust you more, right? Because you're signaling the same thing as I'm signaling. But what's interesting in that is that, some part of you, in order for you to recognize that this is the symbolic belief or groupish belief or religious credence, whatever you want to call it, that we're going to religiously creed, you have to be aware of the implausibility at some underlying level, right? Dan Sperber points out that one of the things that's interesting about anthropologists going to any given society is how quickly they identify the symbolic beliefs, right? How quickly they identify the ones that are really important for ritual or religion or group identity constitution, right? And why might that be? Well, they're the implausible ones, right? Anyway, so important.
It's a little bit like a little bit like costly signaling theory. That the costlier it is for you to embrace something or buy it or say it or whatever, then that it's a signal to your fellow tribe how loyal you are or dedicated or trustworthy.
Yeah. So if you think about that a little further, if factual beliefs, roughly speaking, have the job of tracking what the world is like in order that you don't do actions that fail. Like one of my favorite examples is, okay, you factually believe this switch is connected to the light, you flip it and the garbage disposal goes on, poof, your factual belief is updated, right? You no longer, you had a false factual belief, now you got a true one. Okay, very, very responsive to evidence. So, and where the ditches are, right? Where the fences are, whether your car is working or not. You have to have true factual beliefs to get from point A to point B and without falling in the ditch along the way. All right. That's because factual beliefs guide truth-dependent action. So they need to be what I call evidentially vulnerable. They need to update in light of the empirical evidence from the world. And most of the time, this happens so quickly and smoothly that we don't even realize it. You thought the supermarket was open till 9. You see a sign that says it's open till 8. Poof. Factual belief updates in line with truth, or at least with evidence. All right. But that characteristic feature of factual belief would be a bug when it came to religious credence, right? So if your religious credences say that there's a green god on the mountain or whatever, pick your example, were vulnerable to evidence in the same way, such that they would go poof when there was contrary to evidence, well, you wouldn't be a very loyal group member, would you? Right? If your religious beliefs or groupish beliefs could be erased by something as volatile as what the world does, then you're not sticking with us. Rationality is, from the standpoint of a staunch in-group, surprisingly fickle.
So
right?
would religious rituals be along the same line? If I see you every week and you're there in the pews and you're eating the cracker, you're not eating meat on Fridays or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
what difference does it make what the rituals are? A lot of them are kind of silly, but that isn't the point. The point is
Yeah.
doing the ritual.
Yeah, the ritual is a manifestation of religious credence, right? And this is, if you think about it, I mean, the characteristic, this goes with my theory pretty well. The characteristics of rituals, let's take sacrifice in ancestor worship. All right, we sacrifice an animal to our ancestors who maybe roamed the forests. There's been ancestor worship in a lot of different cultures around the world, and it tends to have sort of some similar structures, right? Where you commonly sacrifice an animal, and the narrative is that you are doing what the ancestors want, right? But you end up eating the meat yourself, all right? And there's going to be rationalizations for that and so on. But it is rather like having an imaginary friend, right? Where you pretend to feed, as a child, you pretend to feed a cookie to your imaginary friend, and then you eat the cookie yourself. All right. So there's that structural parallel between a lot of ritual and make-believe play. It's just the gravity and the seriousness of doing it versus not doing it is amped up by its connection to sacred values, which are different from ordinary economic utilitarian values, and by its connection to group identity, as we've been saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Reading your book, rethinking some of my thoughts in my next book on, mythological truths. So I sent you that chapter.
Yeah.
So why not think of the resurrection of Jesus, or that he died for our sins or whatever, as a metaphorical truth or a literary truth or a mythical truth? It's whether it happened or not literally is beside the point. You're missing the point. My analogy is, asking if there really is a Middle Earth in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Like, what do you mean? It's a novel. It's a story about things. They're asking about Shakespeare's Shylock. Did he really exist? That's not the point. The point is, what did he say? What happened? What are the stories carried? Jane Austen or Dostoevsky? Any great fiction has its own truths.
Yeah.
So I've been trying this out on Christians, particularly when I do public events and debates.
Right.
I'll give you that it's mythologically true. It represents something deep about the human condition, being born again or forgiving people and all the stuff that the resurrection represents, and being born again as a Christian, so on. But they don't seem to be buying this. They're like, no, it literally happened. Paul himself said, if Jesus has not risen, then whatever he said, you shouldn't be a Christian, right? It's like, well, I don't know. It seems like a higher truth. If you're going to do kind of a Jordan Peterson, Joseph Campbell kind of look at this, that what's wrong with having a deep, respectful kind of truth found in literature and arts and myths and so on. And I don't know. It seems like that's not going over well with. Well,
I think I have a couple of comments on that. One, I think you're right. I mean, I am no longer religious, but I love the fact that I learned so many of those stories growing up, like the Joseph story, the Exodus story, Samuel, David, Solomon. Love that stuff, right? Less so the New Testament. It's not quite as fun, but those Old Testament stories are fantastic. And maybe they do represent some underlying truth, right? Okay, let's take a simple example, the Exodus story. Well, here's an underlying truth that the Exodus story represents, setting aside the forward details of the traveling through the desert. Large groups of people don't learn from mistakes easily, right? I think we can both factually believe that one, and there's the story itself does just a beautiful job of working that truth out in detail, right? So this is maybe what you're calling mythological truth. Now, but I think from a psychological standpoint, here's what you need to add to that. The religious person has to somehow be psychologically distinct from the atheist who just really appreciates the stories. All right. So, I'm an atheist who really appreciates the stories, and I even will go along with this idea that there's some underlying truth pointed at. But there has to be, in order for the atheist merely imagines the Exodus story, right? And I would say, look, I enjoy reading the story because it works my imagination, and it's kind of I can even go to plays like Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Well, that's not Exodus, but you see what I'm saying, and really enjoy the theater of it, right? And even go to churches and sometimes enjoy the theater of it. So the question then becomes, well, what differentiates the religious quote unquote believer from the atheist who really appreciates the stories and thinks they're underlying truths? So like you're pointing out, for example. And I think this is where the notion of religious credence actually does some useful work, right? So it's like the religious credence, it's working cognitively like the imaginings, but unlike mere imaginings, it is sort of constitutive of having group identity, right? And that's going to give rise to a whole lot of other features, right? And it also marks something as sacred, right? So if there were some documents portraying, that had biblical text on it, the atheist will say, okay, let's just recycle it if we want the paper. You're much more reluctant if you're someone who has religious credence. So having a group identity, it constrains your behaviors in terms of what you can assert or not assert. So think about it like this. It's like probably the people you talk to, it's like some part of them maybe wanted to say yes. Like, and some Christians will say this maybe behind closed doors. Like, yeah, it's just this story that gestures at deeper truths. But because they're required to identity signal, right, and in public spaces, talking to the guy who founded Skeptic magazine, they're not their religious credences constrain them to not straightforwardly admit that that's what's going on. Anyway, that's my read on it, right? They have to be distinct somehow from the atheist who merely appreciates the stories. So your question, to be frank, you kind of put them in an awkward position.
Yeah. Okay, I see that now. Right. Okay, let's think about this as pragmatic truths. Can some of these religious doctrines be true in a pragmatic sense? Like, don't eat these mixed kind of foods or wear these kind of mixed clothing, cloths, or any of the rituals. They may actually have value, pragmatically for your personal life, for social life. They work. Whether they're true or not, again, is beside the point. It's kind of a pragmatic truth.
Yeah, I mean, look, religion wouldn't be around if it weren't doing something.
Doing something useful, yeah. Right.
So let's distinguish between the normative and the descriptive claims of any given religion. I'm kind of, my book is more focused on the descriptive claims, like kind of asking the question, like you ask in your recent book, like why rational people, I'll put it in scare quotes, believe crazy things, right? And that's where I developed this idea that religious credence is like imagining. But the normative things like rules, like, don't work on the Sabbath, or, pray 5 times a day, or sacrifice to the ancestors, or, have this kind of come of age ritual. Okay, those are going to be normative. Those are going to be normative claims. And they're kind of like commands. Right. And some of them are going to be, very, very much just incidental kind of ornamental things that help distinguish you from the other group. Right. So whether or not you wear the hat this way or this way, it might signal your group identity. There's no functionality to it. But I do think a lot of them, like the community building aspects, they are functional, right? So I remember, for example, in 2016, I was in Israel for a wedding. So And I was staying with modern Orthodox Jews, and on Saturday I really loved it. I mean, we didn't do anything, right? There's all this food laid out, everything was set up, and we could just hang out, right? And it's like being required to not do work is better than just not doing work, because you don't even worry about it, right? So I've tried to institute that without being religious. So I think, kind of communal meals, they do have a lot of social function and pragmatic value, and support systems. I mean, all the studies seem to show that religious people tend to be, healthier mentally and physically. I don't think that's through supernatural agency. It's through having more community. So yeah, there's going to be all sorts of functionality.
But then there's a related subject that I talked about in that chapter I sent you, Martin Gardner, the great skeptic, who was also a believer, sort of, a fideist, Fideist, called himself, based on William James's and Miguel Unamuno's pragmatism theory of truth. No one knows for sure if there's a God or not, and no one knows for sure if we're determined or we have some kind of free will or whatever, on why there's something rather than nothing. And when it can't be determined empirically, and it's important to your life, it's okay to just go ahead and believe whatever you want. So as Martin said, I think there is a God, even though I think the atheists have better arguments than the theists, but still,
right.
Or that, I can pray, or I think there's an afterlife or whatever. I don't know. What do you think about arguments like that?
Well, I think they equivocate on the word believe.
Okay.
Is the crucial flaw there. I mean, maybe what he's doing is okay, but if he's saying, oh, I think the atheists have better arguments, but I'm going to believe anyway, he's not believing it in the factual belief way that I believe Atlanta is in Georgia, and you believe that Santa Barbara is in California, right? That really is, heavily constrained by evidence, and you can't just decide to do it. If you factually believe, like I factually believe that the light was connected, that the switch was connected to the light, and garbage disposal goes on when I hit the switch, and poof, right? I can't choose to factually believe other than what the evidence tells me to do. So the fact that it was a voluntary state that he was engaged in already shows it's a different kind of cognitive relation from your ordinary factual belief. So this actually is an argument that, I like William James, and I like that essay, The Will to Believe, but I think he really is doing a disservice by equivocating on the word believe. And it's kind of like, okay, well, why not just, if it's a different psychological state, call it something different? And in point of fact, people kind of do, because they tend to use believe for what I call religious credence, and think for factual beliefs, right? Even though there's a lot of variation in that. That's a kind of general tendency, right? So even intuitively, people are differentiating religious credence and factual belief by their usage of the words think versus believe. Yeah. And it's really kind of academics. I'm gonna annoy my philosophical friends who have conflated a bunch of different kinds of things under this one noun, belief, right? Then that has led to a lot of confusion about what's going on psychologically with religious attitudes.
A really good point. I mean, I make the point of, do you believe in evolution? No, it's not something I believe in. It just is. Like the Big Bang Theory, it just is. It's a fact of nature. But where I would say I believe in a more open approach to immigration, or I believe in a progressive tax system versus a regressive tax. There, I would use the word belief.
That's right. So take this phrase, and it comes very naturally. Heartfelt belief. Okay, I have a heartfelt belief that we should be kind of immigrants, or that immigrants have done really good things for the United States. And well, my grandparents were immigrants, but even contemporarily, they're still doing good things for the United States. That's a heartfelt belief. But you don't describe your straightforward factual beliefs as heartfelt, right? Michael has the heartfelt belief that Google Chrome is a web browser. No,
Right.
you just think
Right.
it's so, and you're right. And you say, or that it's so. So one kind of move that people kind of try to make against my theory is that you're saying, oh, Pete, you're saying religious credence is a kind of imagining. And what about these people who really have heartfelt beliefs? And I'm saying, well, the fact that you're using the phrase heartfelt, it just shows it's not the same sort of thing as factual beliefs, right? Again, Dan Sperber has a great way of putting this. Factual beliefs are what appear just like plain knowledge to the person who has them. Now, they might not be, right? You might be mistaken about something, but if you factually believe that P, it seems to you like you know that P, right? Whereas this more emotion-laden kind of embrace of an idea, that's already a different thing.
Yeah.
And we track it as telltale signs in language. That's what I was trying to do in the research that focused on think versus believe.
But there in my example, I believe in a high tax rate for upper income, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no right answer to that. So when I'm signaling, when I say I believe, I'm signaling my democratic tendencies, or if I go the opposite, my conservative tribe, or something like, I believe in low taxes and small government.
Right.
That's different than I believe in evolution.
Yeah. Yeah. The political beliefs, this is kind of why I focus on religious beliefs.
Yeah.
They're kind of oddly mixed, right? I gave a research presentation once that was called something like why political convictions are in between religious credence and factual belief, right? And there is let's stick with descriptive propositions, right? Like lowering the tax rate increases the GDP, right? Now, you might just think it's so, right? You might be an economist who thinks, yeah, the GDP will rise if we lower the tax rate. But for a lot of people, they have something more like a religious credence attitude toward that same proposition, right? And you're going to see the kind of identity constituting features, the sacred value type stuff where there's outrage when people argue the contrary, or people kind of form pacts around it. And it's also less revisable in light of contrary evidence, right? So this is another point that I'd like to emphasize. In principle, anything can be sacralized, right? Anything can be made into something that you religiously creed. And so we see that from, the free market true believers, I think that most of the economy should be largely free market, right? I'm not ideologically opposed to it. I think it's probably a good idea for many things, maybe most things, right? But the free market true believers have a different attitude, right? A different attitude type. So anything can be sacralized. And we should just at least be honest with ourselves, what's going on with our own attitudes and the attitudes of others.
How about land? Is this the problem in the Middle East? The land is being sacralized, and to try to put a price on it, it'd be like anyway. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, this is just for your listeners. I'll preview a little bit. I go into sacred values in chapter 7 of my book, and they work different from ordinary utilitarian values, right? So our system of valuing that we can think of as economic or utilitarian, it's pretty rational. It trades things off fairly well. Like if I were to ask you the question, okay, is that pair of sneakers worth the cost of a year's Netflix subscription? You would think about it and be like, okay, I hadn't thought about that, but I can sort of evaluate that question, right? Whereas is that piece of the cross in your living room worth the value of a year's Netflix subscription? Now that gives what is called constitutive incommensurability. It's a different way of valuing things. So what the relation between religious credence and sacred values is, you can think of people's religious credences as kind of a map layer or a transparency that lies on top of their factual beliefs, including their factual beliefs about the geography of certain patches of land, right? So it's not like the cartographers. I mean, aside from where the boundaries are drawn, but the survey cartographers and all of them who chart out where the mountains are, and everyone has the same factual beliefs about what the landscape is. Maybe this river is a little bit wider on one map versus the other map. So you have your religious narratives are like this transparency that lays on top of it. And then what it does is it designates certain entities, objects, events, and behaviors as the ones that the sacred value system should be attached to, right? And one of the features of sacred valuing is, like I said, constitutive incommensurability, which means that certain trade-offs are taboo and they produce outrage if they're proposed. And then also, various other things like insensitivity to the probability of success. So if a behavior is supposed to, produce some gain in Holy Land or something like that, it might be extremely improbable that it would produce any good outcome in that direction in an instrumental sense. But you might still feel that you have to do it because of your sacred values, right? So sacred values have a cluster of characteristics that I gather together under the term inviolability. And that, to combine with religious credences that mark off certain patches of land as the sacred ones and the holy ones in the context of certain wider narratives, really makes it hard to compromise. There's lots. Here's one way of putting it. If we look at just the amount of space, it's the Israel plus the West Bank plus Gaza. It's not a huge territory, but it's big enough. It's big enough for all the people that are there, right? So the problem isn't that of pure utilitarian. That comes in as well. But the fighting really comes in due to these historical narratives that activate sacred values.
Sure, to the point where if Biden went to either side and said, okay, I have a solution. I'm getting the checkbook out. We're just going to buy all the land and property, buildings, everything, and give it to the other side, and we'll take care of you in some other place, Madagascar or something.
The amount of money we've spent, we could buy everyone a mansion.
I know.
Right?
Yeah. But that would just be a sacred value that you can't put a price on it.
Yeah. And work by Scott Atran and colleagues shows that not only is that not going to work, trying to incentivize violations of sacred values actually increases the outrage in at least in certain groups of people, right? So it's like, okay, I say, hey, Michael, I want to have some of your territory. You say, no, that's sacred. I say, well, what if I give you $1 million? Then you get even more mad, right? Yeah. So that's what I call an incentive outrage.
The only acceptable response is outrage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
remember that film Indecent Proposal with Robert Redford and Woody Harrelson and Demi Moore, where Robert Redford plays a billionaire and offers Harrelson and his wife, Demi Moore character, $1 million for one night with your wife.
Right.
At first they're like, oh, God, this is just, and then they're like, this really could make a difference. Of course, then the rest of the movie, she does it. And it's just sex for her, and then it becomes more than that. Because sex is not something, it's in that sacred value realm, which is why prostitution is always resisted or always controversial. Even with consenting adults, I'm largely libertarian on this front, whatever consenting adults do is none of my business. Sex work, that's now the term, sex work. It's an honorable thing. What's wrong with women making thousands of dollars or even tens of thousands of dollars a month doing this? There's lots of stories of women that put themselves through college easily doing, cam work or whatever. But the pushback seems to be, but they're going to pay for it later. They're kind of corrupting their values, their character, something bad. They're going to resent it. But I've talked to some women. They go, "No, I don't resent it. Thank you very much. I'd resent working at McDonald's for minimum wage. I'd rather be doing this." It's like, but in your 30s, you're going to resent what you did in your 20s. I don't know. It's just like,
and really, no, I agree with you. But then also, from a psychological standpoint, there is the Indecent Proposal movie. It does sort of dramatize that difference between what I'm calling the utilitarian values system and the sacred values system, right? And it's creating what what I think Philip Tetlock would call a taboo trade-off.
Yes,
right, where you're trading something sacred, right? So this, marriage, it's surrounded by sacredness. Even if you're secular, there are these rituals that you go through and bonds and so on and so forth. And kind of the whole point of it, and this is where I've been going with my thinking recently, of having religious credence and all this sacralization, is to take you out of the territory of rational choice, right? And that's, the person who would get outraged, and just say, hell no, I'm not going to take your money, is actually the person who you want by your side when things get really tough, right?
Yeah, you can't be bought off.
yeah. And so the having of religious credences is kind of a way of a really what you might call strategic irrationality or purposeful irrationality, where it's putting you in a space where you can be a trusted, staunch in-group member, right? Because you're willing to bear these costs and so on, right? So it's like you wouldn't really want someone who could, just Peter Singer like engage in the payoffs and so on and so forth.
Calculus, yeah.
I agree with you. Like, look, I go to a massage therapist, and it's, in terms of the physical interaction, okay, we don't engage in any sexual touching, but this guy has his hands all over my body, and I give him $135 at the end, right? Like why would prostitution be so much worse than that, right? And people can't really explain it, right? And because it's not the sort of thing that you're supposed to be able to explain.
Well, like if your spouse asked you, why do you love me? If you quantified it, well, because, you're at 8.5 on a scale of 1 to 10, and you're this funny and you're that intelligent, it kind of implies, well, if I find somebody who's a 9 out of 10 and is 10 points more intelligent than you or whatever, I might just abandon you and go for this other one. Right. Whereas the other answer is, it's just because you are you in some kind of airy-fairy, I don't know, I'm just in love with you. You're the perfect person for me. There is no number to put on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the game theorists would kind of make the point in roughly the following way. There are certain things that can't be gotten by being rational, right? And a bond with other people that you can really trust and rely on is kind of that nature, whether it's with an individual, as in a marriage, or as in a group with a religion. All right. So the question is, here's one way of seeing what's going on with religious activity, right? It's a way, on the one hand, of signaling, but on the other hand, a way of inculcating the disposition to be irrational, not under the sphere of rational choice, in the right circumstances and in the right contexts, right? So the religious rituals, they inculcate certain emotions or emotional dispositions that would render you irrational in a way that makes you a trustworthy group member. All the while, you can still, 6 days a week, till the fields and irrigate things and be super empirical, right? So that's kind of where I don't quite put it that way so much in the book, but that's where I'm headed with thinking about this.
Other examples of these sacred value violations, Woody Allen's line, he holds up his wrist with the watch on it, and he says, "My grandfather on his deathbed sold me his watch." It's like, wait, what?
Right.
And then the psychiatrist Sally Satel, I don't know if you know her work, but she does a lot of work on organ donations. She herself is a recipient of a kidney. Kidney. And so she campaigns for this because there's a lot of people that have extra kidneys that they don't need the second one, and they could help. And there's a long line of people, and there's just not enough these
Yeah.
motorcycle accidents and so on. But the biggest resistance is something like it's just you can't put a price on organs, and then
Right.
poor people would be
Right.
taken advantage of, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I do think, with bodily autonomy, that is treated as sacrosanct, right? And I think there are, if we, again, I'm not so religiously inclined myself, but I do think that, having certain things be regarded as a sacred value, or your sacred value system attaches to them, it does kind of, one, allow us to have common guardrails as a society, and then it also, again, it allows you to have a bond with another person that you wouldn't otherwise be able to have, because you can just be totally confident that certain things are off limit and they'll be there in certain circumstances, right? And you just don't arrive at that kind of predicament through pure rational choice and
Right.
empirical thinking.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm not, I'm not, it's a tension, right? Because you're sort of pre-committing yourself to being irrational when the time comes.
Right. And then there's
It's
these
never going to
different kind
feel
of
settled.
human and social relations where, for example, I go to a restaurant and pay for my meal, but if I go to my friend's house for dinner, I don't offer to pay. It would be rude. In
Right.
fact, he'd be insulted.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's a little reciprocity there. If my friends have us over 3 or 4 times in a row and we never invite them over, they're going to
Yeah.
go, what is wrong with the Shermers? How come they never invite us to their house? And then at some
Yeah.
point, they're not going to invite us anymore. So there's some reciprocity there.
Yeah, there's, I think this is one of the things. I've been focused more on the cognitive side of religious belief, like what are the cognitive dynamics of religious credences, how they're like imaginings, and also the interplays between factual belief and religious credence, right? So there's we didn't get into that, but there's a lot of ways in which factual beliefs are foundational in relation to religious credences. Like when you choose to have a religious credence, it's because you factually believe that that's what the religion requires of you, right? Well, that factual belief could be shared by an atheist, right?
Mhm.
I know what religion requires of people, but there's this sort of governance relation. So there's all sorts of interesting interplays between imaginings and factual beliefs, between religious credences and factual beliefs. So I'm focused mostly on those cognitive dynamics, but there's also just something because I only dedicate one chapter to it, just a wealth of interactions between sacred values and ordinary utilitarian values, right? Where certain face-saving gestures will allow you to satisfy a sacred value for very little cost, right? And it's the stuff like that is super interesting. I mean, this is what Scott Atran works on. He's trying to help, he's a great anthropologist, great cognitive scientist of religion, and he's also been engaged in trying to help governments think how to deal with sacred values better. But gosh, I wish people would just embrace the value of apology once in a while, because you can.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost. I mean, in a real way, it doesn't cost any money. But yeah, maybe a later book I'll try to handle the interactions between
you
sacred
always got to
values.
save. You always got to save the last chapter that was going to make your book too long for the next book. That's what I always do.
Yeah,
okay,
right.
my favorite chapter in your book, The Puzzle of Religious Rationality. So let's.
Yeah, it's one of
see
my
how to
favorites too.
Yeah, how to square that circle. People are clearly rational, as we've been saying, and Hugo Mercier also makes this point. Most people are pretty rational. Most of them don't fall for cults. My favorite part of that book. That we only hear about the ones that joined Jonestown and went to Guyana, or they joined the
Right.
Heaven's Gate and ate the pie, the Marie Callender's pie or whatever, and all that stuff. But, the vast majority of people who went to one of the seminars or whatever, they just never returned. I love this subject because I spent my whole career just thinking about how irrational people are, because that's all I deal with is crazy beliefs.
Right.
But in fact, most people keep gas in the tank, and they take the kids to school, and they got food in the fridge, and they keep their jobs, and they go about their daily lives perfectly rational. So there's a little bit of an availability heuristic, like the Tinder swindler is my other favorite example. If you saw that Netflix series, this was a guy who was scamming women out of money, and he targeted women in their like mid to late 30s who are looking for true love. This is it. Want to get married, have kids, and so on. And then he posts a picture of him on his little Tinder page there next to a private jet. Like, oh my God, handsome guy. Oh my God. So of course they swipe right or left or whichever the right one is. And they go out with him, and they're actually on the jet. I mean, he's got the jet. There he is. They go to this island, and they have a 5-star resort. It's the most romantic weekend of all time. And this goes on and on and on for months. And he's like this mysterious man, international man of mystery, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh, I'm going to Switzerland this weekend for this big business thing. I'm going to close this deal. It's going to be worth like $20 million. And then the big move. He calls them like on a Saturday. I need like $50,000 tomorrow. Of course, I have millions. I'm just going to be, I'll pay you, wire it back to you on Monday. But can you wire me the money now, today? And then that's the move. That's the moment. Do they go for it or not? And that may be a little high. Maybe it was 10,000 initially or 20,000 or however much he thought they had. And then, of course, the show features the ones that went for it. Right. But what we don't know is what's the base rate? How many did he try? 1 out of 100 fell for it or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So in that case, I think that the ones who went for it, they were genuinely tricked, right?
Yeah.
And so that would be probably an example of just a false factual belief, but not an irrational one. I mean, one of the things that's distinctive about this, or maybe not distinctive, but noteworthy, is that he produced a whole lot of evidence to fool him. All right, and he made the evidence experiential. Okay, so he made it highly plausible that now you do have to be gotta be honest, a bit of a fool, but there was a whole lot of evidence in favor of factually believing that this person was a legit.
They showed hundreds and hundreds of texts that women had their phones. I love you. You're the true one. True. This I finally met love. We're gonna have babies. It just went on and on for months.
Right. Yeah. So that might have dialed. In addition to the experiential evidence of the man being rich, there was also the dialing down of the skepticism, right, through the emotional means. Well, I think, let me say what I think is striking about this. I think that's not what's going on with religious belief most of the time, right? So it's not just that the religious texts have fooled people into thinking there's a talking snake, right, or something like, or that leprosy could be cured, or that take the various florid pantheons like Ganesh, right, body of a boy, head of an elephant. Right. It's not like there was all this evidence that there is such a being, aside from, the religious texts, which are, very mythological in character. Right. And so you've got this kind of contrast between what we might say the apparent rationality of human beings who can learn to use a computer, learn to drive a car, learn a trade, learn at least the basics of mathematics, right? Neurotypical people, this is all normal stuff. And if you think about it, it's like, well, learn some facts about history from hundreds of years ago. None of that would be possible without substantial levels of epistemic rationality. But then you look at these religious beliefs, right? Like florid pantheon deities, take Quetzalcoatl, right? A snake with feathers that flies around in Nahuatl religion. Okay, so there's all these things that appear to flout reason. To go back to one of Dan Sperber's examples, when he was among the Dorza in Ethiopia, they were Christian, and they maintained that leopards were also Christian, and so the leopards would fast on Christian days, right? And no, if you actually thought that was true, you'd have to be pretty irrational. So the puzzle of religious rationality, as I lay it out, is how do you square the apparent epistemic rationality of humans, including the vast majority of religious humans, with the apparent irrationality of the apparent religious beliefs, right? or of the religious beliefs. All right. And there's different ways of trying to do it. One, you could say, well, look, the religious folks not rational after all. That's kind of the delusion thing, right? And that's not just people like Dawkins. It's Freud says things along these lines. And in earlier days, a friend of mine, Ryan Mackay, he does a lot of psychology in cognitive science of religion. He had this paper, I think it was in 2004, called Hallucinating God, or God. Yeah, I think it was Hallucinating God, right? And he argues that religious beliefs are delusions. So basically what your solution there is to say, hey, yeah, the religious beliefs are irrational, and so are the people. Poof, problem solved. Problem is, that's wildly false, right? Like, it's, the vast majority of religious people aren't delusional or crazy irrational. On the flip side, you've got the religious apologists who try to argue that the religious beliefs are rational, right? And that's, I don't really even take that solution seriously, right? It's more, to me, that's more of a charade. And even if it worked for one religion, it would leave, all the other religions out in the cold. All right. So the trying to, increase the rationality of the religious beliefs or decrease the rationality of humans, that adjusting of the rationality, it doesn't really work. Another approach is to kind of say that the contents aren't really what they appear to be, right? Like Durkheim says religious beliefs are really about society, but it does leave you with a puzzle of, well, what about the surface level meaning that people appear to take real seriously? And also what differentiates the, atheist who likes the stories from the religious believers, right? So this is a whole different approach for me to come at what I call the attitude solution, which is to say, yeah, religious believers are actually taking a different attitude from factual belief toward their religious stories and doctrines, at least characteristically, one that allows the ordinary day-to-day epistemic rationality of their factual beliefs uncompromised, right? So this is, I don't know, call it a transcendental argument or something like that if you like the Kantian speak for why we should posit a different attitude of religious credence. It allows us to make sense of how otherwise rational people could, quote unquote, believe all these outlandish contents, right, about supernatural agents and events and resurrections and human bodies mixed with animals and so on. They're taking an attitude more like imagining, albeit imagining that is made serious by its connection to sacred value and group identity, right? So that's my solution to the puzzle. It's kind of similar to what you say in your conspiracy book, I think, with proxy conspiracism.
So what's wrong with Steve Gould's NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria, which he developed largely after the Pope said it's okay for Catholics to believe in the theory of evolution, but we get the soul. And Gould says, okay, you can have the soul. We don't do that anyway. These are non-overlapping magisteria. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I think it's mistaken because it makes it sound like the contents of religious beliefs and the contents of science are never going to conflict. They're non-overlapping magisteria. And it maybe for some clusters of religious beliefs, that's true. Maybe they don't. But I mean, there's all sorts of conflict, right? If you're a young earth creationist or any doctrine about the immaterial soul controlling your actions, it's contrary to the laws of physics, right? The physical world is a closed system. And so it just wouldn't be possible for an immaterial soul to be guiding my actions right now. And so Gould makes it sound like they're at the level of content or propositions. There's never going to be a contradiction between the descriptive claims of science. I mean, basically all scientific claims about the world are descriptive, and the descriptive claims of religions. And that's just not so. I mean, there's just too many examples of claims that religious systems make about the world that are descriptive and are at odds with science. So I think Gould had maybe, I'm flattering myself here, but he maybe dimly grasped that people were relating to their religious ideas in a different way from how a scientist will relate to their scientific ideas. But he described it in the wrong way, right? Instead of saying it's a different way of relating to ideas, he's saying, oh, the ideas themselves don't conflict or don't contradict. And in many cases, they simply do. That's what's wrong with his theory.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I knew both him and Carl Sagan, and I think Steve's mistake there was putting it in writing and presenting it as some new idea, rather than it's just a way of interacting with religious people that you don't want to offend. So Carl famously wanted to engage with religious people for larger goals like global warming or reducing nuclear weapons and threats like that. We need the Christians and the Muslims. We need all these people because we're a global civilization. So I think that was really Gould's motive, but then he ended up writing this as if it was a new theory, and then he got ripped apart by a lot of people like Dan Dennett. Dan Dennett, who said, when do you mean they get the morals? You're at a university, Harvard, where some of the great secular moralists of all time are working right down the hall.
Dan was my postdoc mentor, by the way.
He was?
So he's a big influence. Yeah, I did a postdoc at Tufts University. So he's very near and dear to my heart.
Oh, well, yeah, it's so sad we lost him.
Yeah.
That was, he was just bigger than life in every way.
Yeah.
He's a big guy.
If I can say one thing,
Please,
the thing that I admired most about Dan was his incredible natural curiosity. He just loved gobbling up facts and ideas and information. As much as anyone I've ever seen. That's really, as much as anything, the thing that inspires me about Dan Dennett is his true curiosity and love of knowledge.
Yeah, I spent a week with him on a small boat in the Galapagos with Frank Soloway and a few other scientists, and he was working on Breaking the Spell. That's when he was writing it. Cool. So we had him give a little talk for us based on one of the chapters or whatever. Yeah, he was just such a super interesting guy. Yeah, I'd see him at TED quite a bit, and he would just take all those TED Talks and incorporate them into one of his theories or ideas or whatever, AI and computers and anything, really, just any subject. He was truly a Renaissance person. Okay, let me read you something here about, I was writing about witchcraft in the Moral Arc. Here I'm quoting E. Evans Pritchard, his classic study, Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande. Traditional society in southern Sudan and Africa. After a survey of the many bizarre beliefs about witches held by the Azande, Evans Pritchard explained the psychology behind witchcraft beliefs, starting with the fact that, quote, witches, as the Azande conceive them, clearly cannot exist. Nonetheless, the concept of witchcraft provides them with a natural philosophy by which the relations between men and unfortunate events are explained, and a ready and stereotyped means of reacting to such events. And he continues, witchcraft is ubiquitous. It plays a part in every activity of Zonde life, in agricultural, fishing, and hunting pursuits, and domestic life of homesteads, as well as communal life of district and court. It is an important theme of mental life in which it forms the background of a vast phenomenon of oracles and magic. There is no niche or corner of Zonde culture into which it does not twist itself. If blight seizes the ground nut crop, it is witchcraft. If the bush is vainly scoured for game, it is witchcraft. If women laboriously bail water out of a pool and are rewarded by but a few small fish, it is witchcraft. If a wife is sulky and unresponsive to her husband, it is witchcraft. If a prince is cold and distant with his subject, it is witchcraft, and so on. But he goes on to say that it served as a practical function for the Azande socially to function in a relatively harmonious way.
Right.
He says the Azande do not attribute everything that happens to witchcraft, only those things for which they do not have a plausible sounding causal explanation, quoting him. In Zonde land, sometimes an old granary collapses. There's nothing remarkable in this. Every Zonde knows that termites eat the supports in course of time, and then even the hardest wood decay after years of service. But when a group of people are sitting inside the granary when it collapses and they are injured, the Zonde wonder, in Evan Pritchard's description, why should these particular people have been sitting under this particular granary at that particular moment when it collapsed? That it should collapse is easily intelligible. but why it should have collapsed at the particular moment when these particular people are sitting under it. And then he goes on to comment on that.
Yeah. I mean, I love that book. It illustrates a few things. It's what's called in the psychological literature explanatory coexistence. People have studied this. Christine Laguerre has a lot of great work on it. Her early work was on bewitchment explanations for AIDS in Southern Africa versus biological explanations, right? And what she shows, and also this has been replicated in various spheres across culture, is like people know that viruses cause HIV and AIDS, right? And that it's transmitted through sex. But then there's also a coexisting layer of explanation, which is bewitchment, which works, kind of similar to how it works with Evans-Pritchard's. So I think that does illustrate the two-map cognitive structure there, where people have their factual beliefs about things, but this narrative, and I think the way it kind of works in the Zonda case is the sort of bewitchment narratives. It allows for certain kinds of social interactions and certain social rituals that stitch together the community and allow people to make amends for things, right, and so on. So I think, from reading, I'm obviously biased. I was already working on this when I read Evans-Pritchard's book, read it in a grad seminar, or I taught it in a grad seminar, and it sure did seem to me like there was a sort of maybe cognitive distance from what the oracle said. The oracle, just for your audience, is they poison a chicken, and with an ambiguous amount of poison, and if the chicken lives, the oracle is saying one thing. If the chicken dies, the oracle is saying the other thing, right? And a flat-footed interpretation of that would say, oh, they just think the oracle is saying who was bewitching them and who wasn't. But it's much more nuanced than that. And I wish I remember more of the details of it. But there would be a kind of a ceremony where you confronted the person who supposedly bewitched you. And then there would be a kind of show of apology, right? A standard show of apology. And then people would kind of move on, right? And so there were also, when people would test the oracle, this is something I remember very well, they would very smartly not put the names of powerful people in front of the oracle to say, hey, did the chief bewitch me? People didn't do that unless you're on the same level, right? And so it kind of appears to me to be something that it sort of coheres reasonably with my theory. Let me read you one of my favorite quotes from Evans-Pritchard. So this is a little bit later in his career. So I think the Witchcraft and Oracles among the Azanda book, that was 1937 maybe.
Something
thereabouts
like that.
Earlier. Then he had a book that came out in 1965, a bit more theoretical, called Theories of Primitive Religions. And he basically roasts a lot of people's theories of where religion originated. It's a great roast of an academic book, and he's a lively writer. But there is a way of looking at things where I think this goes mainly to Levi-Bruhl or something like that, where there's just this primitive mindset, which would be something like the view that primitive people, kind of an offensive term, but that's how the anthropologists talked back then. They simply factually believed their supernatural ideas, right? And it gives this impression of like a simple-minded, fairies, simply thinking fairies are real and that witchcraft is real and so on and so forth. And Evans-Pritchard, kind of says, look, that gives the wrong impression. So here's his explanation of why anthropologists got the wrong idea, and the idea that there's this primitive mindset, right? So Evans-Pritchard writes, what travelers liked to put on paper was what most struck them as curious, crude, and sensational. Magic, barbaric religious rites, superstitious beliefs took precedence over the daily empirical humdrum routines which comprise 9/10 of the life of primitive man and are his chief interest and concern. His hunting and fishing and collecting of roots and fruits, his cultivating and herding, his building, his fashioning of tools and weapons, and in general his occupation in his daily affairs, domestic and public. These were not allotted the space they fill in both time and importance in the lives of those whose way of life was being described. Consequently, and this is where it really comes home, consequently, by giving undue attention to what they regarded as curious superstitions, the occult and mysterious, observers tended to paint a picture in which the mystical took up a far greater portion of the canvas than it has in the lives of primitive peoples, so that the empirical, the ordinary, the common sense, the workaday world seemed only to have secondary importance, right? So part of what gives people the impression that religious people, and I'll generalize here, just simply straightforwardly factually believe, is a bias of attention, right? If you only look at what they do on Sunday and in their rituals, you might think, well, this is just how things are for them all the time. But if you look at the broader swath of life, you realize, well, there's a lot of compartmentalization going on, right? And I think that's also true. I think he shifted his tune a little bit over the course of his career, but that's a topic for a different day. Evans Pritchard scholarship. It'd be worth it, but I don't know if I'll be able
so
to.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know that literature as well as you, but that is super interesting. So it reminds me a little bit of Tanya Luhrmann's other book about the voices that people hear in their heads.
Yeah, When God Talks Back.
Yeah, When God Talks Back. Yeah, that's an interesting subject, because this is not like the three Christs of Ypsilanti, where that psychiatrist brought three mentally ill patients together, each of whom thought he was Jesus. And
gosh, I haven't seen that.
Oh yeah, no, Ypsilanti, Michigan. There was a mental health, a mental illness hospital there, and three of them thought they were Jesus. So he thought, I'll put them all in the room together, and they can all see they're delusional. And each of them thought the other two were delusional. Oh, these two guys are crazy. Right. They think they're Jesus. I'm the one. Yeah. Anyway, but that isn't what So when atheists say, "Oh, these people are delusional," they're hearing voices. The average person is not hearing voices. These aren't temporal lobe seizures like Joan of Arc or Paul, Saul on the road to Damascus. All of a sudden hears this voice. The average person isn't hearing anything like that, right? But they are hearing something. They're hearing the inner voice we all have. And so, but did they think every little inner voice is God? No, they don't. It seems to be related to highly unusual events or important events, or I was thinking this, and then I went left instead of right, and then this thing happened, and I almost was on this plane that went down, or what, just the kind of concatenation of different events that happened that turned out well or bad if it's a Satan thing, and that gets interpreted in that kind of sacred way. I was just at a conference where a small group of us, maybe 10, were going around the room explaining who we were. One of them, there was two of us atheists, and there was a born-again, two evangelical Christians, and then some others that different beliefs. Anyway, but the evangelical preacher, he told us a story about a gunman who was in the parking lot at his church. It's one of these things that could have been tragic, and
wow.
But he gave it like a series of like a dozen things that happened that alerted somebody who was in the parking lot to stop this guy, and they intervened, and nothing bad happened, and this guy was mentally ill or whatever. But the way he told it, he described it, it was a miracle. I mean, it was a miracle that nobody was killed, given all the school shootings and mass public shootings and so on. So I said, by miracle, do you mean statistically unlikely and therefore very improbable and boy, lucky me? He goes, no, I mean like divine intervention. So I said, well, okay, you mean you think God actually intervened and made this person go left instead of right, and then they saw the guy in the parking lot? Yeah, that's what I mean. I said, all right, where was God at Sandy Hook? And then the room grew silent, and somebody said, hey, we're not here to discuss that. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And
you were
he had
breaking the spell.
I was breaking the spell, right? Because that's not really what it was about, I guess. Something like that. Yeah.
Well, here's you might I don't think I shared this one with you, but I've got a paper called Seeking the Supernatural that I wrote with a Dutch cognitive scientist and neuroscientist, Michiel van Elk, and it syncs a lot with what Tanya Luhrmann says in When God Talks Back. And the way she puts it is people cherry pick events both from their lives. She uses the phrase cherry pick from their lives and from their mental lives. So extraordinary events and feelings and so on. And so what people do is they want to have a personal story of their relationship with God, right? Call this is what Michiel and I call the problem of personal belief. All right, so you have all these religious beliefs and so on. Where are you mentioned in them? You're not, right? Unless you're the Pope or something like that, or, unless you're one of the founders of religion, you're not mentioned in the religious stories and doctrines. So how do I get into this personal story, right? So what people do is, and there are practices, and really a lot of Tanya Luhrmann's work is about exploring ethnographically the practices that people engage in to pluck out the kind of vivid or the highly salient events in their mental or day-to-day lives, and then you can weave those in light of your background general religious beliefs into a personal story about how the deity is relating to you, right? So in my framework, and this is very sympathetic to what she would be saying, is that those are what Kendall Walton calls props in a game of make-believe, right? Where you're partly constrained by what the props do. What happens? Did the guy shoot or not? But the main kind of practice is to weave those props into a story that gives you a personal relationship to God. And the kind of exercise you're engaged in, well, where was God with Sandy Hook? Or why did God let that guy get to the parking lot in the first place? Right? Right. So it's in a sense, it's breaking the spell, because you're like the guy, from my perspective, you're like the guy in the theater who shouts out, "It's not Hamlet, it's just an actor."
Right.
Like, come on, man, shut up.
Yes.
We're trying to have a moment.
Yes, right. Yeah, so you would call it the willing suspension of disbelief, right? Something like that.
That's a good phrase for it.
Yeah. That reminds me of a funny story. I had, we used to host a public lecture series every month at Caltech for like 25 years.
Okay.
And one time I found an actor who played Einstein, and he had a whole one-man show in which he basically went through Einstein's life and his theories, and he had memorized all the stuff about special relativity and global relativity. And then in the Q&A afterwards, like, well, what kind of acting did you do before that? And how did you enjoy acting as Einstein? Whatever he said. But a couple people started asking him technical questions about global relativity. He's like,
wow.
I'm an actor, right? I have any idea what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It was really funny. They forgot to willingly suspend their disbelief there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, people will profess religious doctrines they don't understand either. Right?
But we all do this when we go to the movies, right? That's not the Titanic up on the screen. So and of course, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what makes the movie better. Is there anything wrong with religious people who do that?
Well, I think I try to mostly avoid normative stances in my book, because it's really more about understanding what's going on psychologically.
Yeah.
But I will say that there is a tension, and one that's maybe very criticizable, between the fact that psychologically speaking, religious credence is this compartmentalized thing, but then it can start to, in political context, it can spill outside the compartment. And I think especially in when there's a sort of political movement, there can be a tendency to want to inflict one's religious credences on other parts of society. And that can be a sort of aggressive thing, right? And so, I mean, take a contrasting example, right? So my friend's 80-year-old mom in Italy, who's a practicing Catholic, goes to mass every Sunday and crosses herself at all the right times and so on. And if men want to get married, that's their thing, and she kind of knows intuitively when to check her Catholicism at the door. I think what we see a lot of the time, though, is a sort of expansion of the sacralized context in a way that steps on each other's, that steps on outsiders' feet, right? And as someone who believes in separation of church and state, I think that's bad, right? That's also why, I mean, another little piece of evidence from my view is why is religious hypocrisy so common, right? Like people aren't hypocritical about acting as if gravity exists, right? They don't declare gravity exists and then go around acting like gravity doesn't exist.
Right.
But people are very hypocritical about their God beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. So that kind of shows two things. One, it is more like an imagining, right? Because it goes on holiday when other people aren't looking, or you're not in the sacred context. But then also that there's something not quite right about it's like if you, okay, so you play Hamlet, let's say you're playing Hamlet, and you tried to get other people to assent to it, right? Well, that would be, or you try to get the laws of the nation to recognize your Hamletness, right? Or something like that. I mean, I think that's wrong, right? So I don't have, again, I'm not a political theorist, so I don't have a clearly worked out view, but I think we can describe the underlying cognitive dynamics well enough, right? If the signaling function of religious credence involves imposing your will on others, as it does very much in the American context, then you're doing something that from an objective moral standpoint is wrong.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you about Ben Alderson Day's book Presence. I had him on the show, The Strange Science and True Stories of Unseen Other. The sense presence, the third man effect, all these weird anomalous psychological experiences that people have. Now, out of the religious context, could be like sleep paralysis is interpreted by as alien abductions. It used to be, witches and demons and incubi and succubi harassing people in their beds at night. The culture tells us how to interpret these anomalous psychological experiences. How does that fit into your model?
Yeah, I haven't read the book, but it fits in pretty well. I mean, the brain is a complicated thing, and you have unusual experiences if you're in a high altitude or you're kind of in between sleeping and waking. You're going to have unusual experiences, and we have capacities for hair trigger capacities for detecting other agents that give us these low level intuitions that there's something weird here, and those can be wrong, right? And so the question is, well, what do we do with that? And I think what happens a lot you can go one of two ways. Someone might factually believe that there's a third person going around with them. I guess T.S. Eliot talks about this in The Wasteland. It's a pretty cool passage. But it might just be that you recognize I'm having these weird intuitions and they're leading me astray here, right? I mean, when you see a bent stick in the grass, you might leap back like it's a snake. Right. But it's a further step to go on and believe it, right? And I would say there's a sort of cognitive juncture that might happen. You might factually believe that there was, this weird demon or something like that, or you could use it like I was talking about before. You use that as an opportunity to weave for yourself a narrative, a personal narrative of your relation to the divine, right? I was afflicted by a demon, right? Or something like that. And that's if we look at the Vineyard. I've read a couple Vineyard ethnographies, including Tanya Luhrmann's and also John Bielewski's, and the sort of demon narratives, they do tend to be fairly compartmentalized, right? So Bielewski points out that people don't really ever act like they're afflicted by demons, except for when there are other co-religionists around, right? Well, that's kind of interesting. Why is it that the demon only shows up when there are other religious people around? And it's sort of a way of being part of the story, right? It's taking what may be real kind of psychological afflictions, but you're taking your general background religious credences and interpreting the psychological afflictions in that light, so you can tell yourself a personal story. So you use the low-level visceral experiences essentially as props in your game of make-believe, to go back to Kendall Walton's way of talking.
All right, on page 77, you talk about taking God seriously. You're quoting here from Tanya Lerman's, you may think you believe in God, but really you don't. You don't take God seriously enough. You don't act as if he's there. Mark 9:24, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.
Yeah.
That's such a great passage.
Opening passage of her how God becomes real. Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, is it that, is she saying there that a lot of believers that are losing faith in a way are not taking God seriously enough because it's not in the category of an empirical truth where you're losing your faith, but you're thinking about it the wrong way?
I think this is maybe something that's, I don't want to call it unique to Christianity, but it's much more pronounced in Christianity than other religions, and maybe even more so in the American evangelical context. So what's interesting about Christianity is it's not, you don't just share the stories and the ideas and do the rituals that you ought to do. Christianity makes it constitutive of being a member of the group, of being saved, right? But it's really of being a member of the group, that you have certain beliefs, right? And so, you know, with other religions, if you do the rituals and share the stories, I mean, you have your religious credences, but you're not doctrinally fixated on your own psychological state. Do I have the belief or not? But from a very young age, and I, you know, because I grew up in a Christian family, you're kind of checking yourself. Do I have the belief or not? Right? And you know, people are not, but by a long shot, perfect introspectors. But Christians will notice that they have doubts and that they're not so sure. Whereas, you know, someone who, you know, say among the Azande, if they were like had their doubts about the oracle, it's kind of, it doesn't matter. I do it anyway. This is what you're supposed to do. I'll do it. I'll do what I got to do. And yeah, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. Right. So, but there's a level of, is the kind of belief that I have enough that comes out, I think, you know, this is a sort of cross-cultural conjecture, but I think there's some evidence for it. It comes out more in Christianity just because of the doctrinal focus on having belief that's more pronounced in Christianity, right? So if you have religious credences as opposed to factual belief, and you're even dimly aware of that difference, as I think, you know, many people are, you might be thrown into a fit of doubt, like, oh, wait a second, maybe I don't have the right kind of called for belief. And you'll see this in the writings of analytic philosophers who are Christians, right? So William Alston, Dan Howard Snyder, they have this acceptance model of faith where it's enough to accept the doctrines, where acceptance is a different kind of cognitive state from just factually believing, right? So it's kind of like my distinction, but they're less, you know, into the empirical psychology. So they argue acceptance is enough for faith, right? And you can, I mean, especially in the writing on this of Bill Alston, you can sort of feel the palpable anxiety, right? Like, does what I have count as faith, right? And I think that's something that would come out more in the Christian tradition than in other traditions, because the fact that you don't act on it, you know, you've got this phrase, once a week Christian, the fact that you don't act on this belief 6 days a week, it might be a pretty good clue that it's not like your belief that gravity exists, right? Or that electricity exists, right? Or that Atlanta's in Georgia, right? Those beliefs guide action across the board. And so, yeah, you have people feeling that their beliefs should be uncompartmentalized, and then noticing that they're really compartmentalized, and that, you know, produces a lot of agony, and that's why people engage in a lot of rituals to try to get themselves to believe more.
Mm. I have noticed in tracking the creationist movement for a long time, it's mostly a Christian phenomenon. I mean, there's a tiny handful of Muslims and Jews who are Creationists, but very, very rare. It's almost entirely a Christian phenomenon. Why is that? Is it, is it that they're more obsessed with this, kind of religious credence having to be tied to an empirical truth? The earth really is under 10,000 years old and so on. And therefore, if I give that up, then I have to give up the rest of the Bible, whereas Jews and Muslims don't think like that. And also, is it historical with the rise of science? Like, you're supposed to have evidence for your beliefs. Look, this is what the scientists do, and now science has power in society, so that's what we should do. Would somebody, a Christian 700,000 years ago, be having this kind of conversation?
Oh, gosh.
Those are big questions.
So I do think there is some cultural relativity about this. There's a paper by Jonathan Jong and colleagues. I don't think Jonathan is the first author, that shows that it seems like Americans are more bothered by conflict between science and religion than other cultures, right? So other cultures might be able to say, hey, look, here's my Hindu narrative, and, science can do what it does and it'll figure things out, but I'm still gonna, believe my stories, right? So kind of like the who was the gentleman in the story that you said talked to Richard Dawkins?
Oh, Ken Miller, yeah.
Yeah, Ken Miller. So that's one stance, right? And I think that stance is relatively common in a lot of places. I think it's kind of, if I had to speculate, it's kind of a combination of the intense focus on belief that we get in American Christianity, together with the rise of science dominance. It kind of, converged into this, very common evangelical literalism, right? And at the end of the day, it's also a costly signal. All right, if you're willing to go all in on saying, yeah, I'm going to throw all this science under the bus, that burns bridges with out groups, but it bonds you to the in group more, and it serves as a costly signal of your commitment to the in group, right? So you're going to see, in terms of the sort of floridness and kind of apparent outlandishness or genuine outlandishness of the various beliefs, along with the kind of vigor with which they're asserted. It's like the more serious the religious in group, the stronger those signals are going to be, right? And I think the young Earth creationism is one manifestation of that.
Oh my God, Neil, we've been going over 2 hours. Oh my God, it's almost a record for me. That's great. This is all so interesting. All right, last question. Let's turn your theory on yourself. What happened to you?
What happened to me is, I'll just be, I could tell a whole story. I think what happened to me is what happens to a lot of people who fall away from the religion. It's like you start out, I think, young intellectual, you start out actually factually believing there's a God in the stories and doctrines. And, you get to a choice point and you just don't want to do it. You don't want to have these kind of religious games of make-believe. It felt dishonest to me, right? So there were, along the way, I went to a Christian summer camp, and when I was 12, I was trying to figure out, well, why I'd heard of the theory of evolution, knew a little bit about it. Why do Christians say it's wrong? So I went to this one-day workshop where one of the camp counselors was going to show why evolution is false. I'll be, well, that's useful to know, right? So many people think it's true. And I guess two things happened. One, I just saw how my 12-year-old mind could just easily see how bad these arguments were, right? Like, the theory of evolution is no more plausible than an airplane coming together from the wind. Right. Like, that's not what it says. I'm 12, and I was looking at a kid next to me, and he was kind of in the same boat as I was. But it more than just making me think, hey, maybe some of these other doctrines are not true, are also not true. It kind of made me lose respect for the people in charge, right? And so I think there's very much a social element. And this is what the literature on conversion and deconversion show. I think it's also true in my case. It was as much I didn't really want to belong to this tribe is why I gave up the religious credences. As the I was just being honest with myself that the stories and doctrines appeared false, right? And I think I think maybe a little bit, unusual, or not extremely unusual, but I think people vary in their need to have a group identity, right? I'm a bit of a loner, and I think people who are kind of low on the scale of needing an in-group to belong to fall away from religion much more easily, right? I think that's probably also part of the fact in my case.
You mentioned conversion, deconversion literature. What are the theories about this, roughly speaking?
Yeah, the basic idea that emerged in 20th century conversion literature is this idea that the Paul on the road to Damascus model, like the sudden blitz of religious truth hits you and that's why you join a religion. It's not really true in most cases, right? People have social motives for joining a religion, right? So this is, a lot of it's the work of Rodney Stark and his colleagues. When people joined, say, the Moonies out in San Francisco, that's sort of this quasi-religious cult, they would weigh the social costs and benefits of belonging to the group, right? And then once they had decided to join, then eventually the religious beliefs would start to fall into place. Now, there's an equivocation here on the word rational, right? Because they can say, well, they adopted their religious beliefs rationally. Well, no, they joined the group rationally, but then the religious beliefs were kind of what happened afterwards, right? And not through an evidential process, just because this is what it takes to belong kind of process. So yeah, the idea of from the recent conversion literature is just that sort of social choice model, right? Yeah. And he applies that in his great book, Rise of Christianity. He applies that in the historical context and makes it clear why a lot of people at the margins of society, oftentimes they weren't at the margins of society in terms of poverty, but in terms of what their identity is, they could get a lot out of joining this new sect, Christianity. Christianity had a lot to offer, in terms of what it could do for people, especially women, because women were treated very badly in the Roman Empire. At least so Rodney Stark argues. And then deconversion on that side, the more typical reason why people deconvert from a religion is not like, oh my gosh, I just saw a bunch of evidence and apparently snakes don't talk and people don't rise from the dead. That's not what's going on. So it's not really an evidence-driven process, right? People are perfectly aware of those things that render their religious beliefs implausible. It's usually some sort of social break, right? Where a religious leader has done something immoral, or the religious community is not all it's cracked up to be from a moral perspective. And so the reasons both for conversion and deconversion are largely of a social nature, right? Which I think dovetails pretty well with my view that it's it's not a factual belief, because factual beliefs are vulnerable to evidence. It's more of a voluntary kind of religious credence that people will discard with difficulty, but when it's no longer worth it to them to continue with this group.
Yeah, it's like that story that came out of after Mother Teresa's death, that she, in her diary, she was talking about her doubts about God's existence.
Yeah. I would put it like this: religious credence can coexist with all sorts of underlying epistemic states, right? Religious credence is your identity constituting imaginative state, right? And that can coexist with more and less confidence that the doctrines are actually true. What I put it in another paper is identity centrality is different from epistemic confidence, right? So religious credences can coexist with doubt one day, maybe a little bit more factual belief the next day, right? And so it's kind of like what one of Tanya Lerman's informants said is faith means I'm sticking with it, even though I don't believe it. Right. And so, yeah, you can, part of the what the model says is just, you can have these religious credences and all sorts of other stuff going on. But if you firmly factually believe that there is no such God, then you're kind of more in the direction. And if you also feel like a phony in terms of the group identity, right? If it's like, look, I'm just here because that's how I get my paycheck, right? That's another dimension where you can say, hey, these are fakers. These are not genuinely devout.
I mean, I could sort of imagine you preaching to people to be good and let's take care of our each other. And, oh, Mary has cancer. Let's all think good thoughts for her and her family and help them, and so on. But at some point, if the parishioners insist that, there's a deity behind it and that we actually pray for some outcome and you don't think the prayer is going to work, that could put you in a bind.
Yeah. That's something interesting to study. The sort of wrestling that happens between what the parishioners want to hear and what the clergyman feels like saying, it's a negotiation.
Yeah. Another thing I've been thinking about is the self-help movement. I mean, we used to be pretty critical of the Tony Robbins of the world. But in a way, a lot of the religious rituals are doing the same kind of thing, reminding you to take care of yourself and be good and do all these things, because we need reminding, right? I used to joke about this. The number one predictor of anybody that would buy a self-help book is somebody who already bought a self-help book. Well, if it works, why do you need to keep buying more books and the tapes and the posters and all that stuff? And the answer seems to be because you need to be reminded every day, because tomorrow's a different day and you're going to be weak. You're going to want the cheesecake. You're going to sleep in instead of working out.
Also, I mean, I guess, what is he called? The motivational speaker. Right? I mean, motivation is fickle.
Yes.
Right?
Every day it's fickle. Right. So in a way, I mean, religions serve something of a role like that. Every week we're going to remind you, this is what we do. We tithe and we take care of people and we man the soup kitchens and we, this is what good people do. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay.
Yeah. It's largely, this is kind of what I was saying earlier about management of the underlying emotions. Right.
Oh, right.
You do that well or badly, or in some ways well and in some ways badly.
All right, Neil, I could talk to you all day about this, but let's wind it up here. Religion is make-believe. There's the cover with the feathers on that. I love that cover design, by the way. They
very
did a good
clever
job. Yeah, they did. They
if I could plug it, if people don't want to buy it, I ask people to recommend it to their local public library.
Okay, there we go.
So that it's available to as many people as possible. And I would love to hear from people if they want to look me up on Instagram or Facebook or find my email. I'll happily hear people's comments.